Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about how genetics influence development. Now, for this, we have to understand that this is a brand new science. The idea of genetics and our ability to look at DNA and figure out what's going on started around the 1960s, and we have been evolving that science ever since. You could say in modern times that the science is evolving rapidly, and we're able to figure out more and more about how DNA, ribosomes interpreting DNA, and genetics all play a role in human development. For this class, I don't need you to be masters of biology. The most important thing to take from this lecture is that your genetics influence your behavior, the way you think, and the way your body evolves over time. It also is associated with things that you're at risk for, what you might be susceptible to, things along those lines. So, what we really want to take from this is genes play a role in how our bodies and our brains evolve, and then they influence us throughout our lifespan. So, what are we going to learn about in this class? We're going to touch on a little bit about DNA, and we're going to talk about chromosomes and how all that combines to make babies, and then how we evolve biologically over time. Okay? All right, so for the humans, not for the humans. I always think about this because when you start to go back in millions of years, that's how far you have to go back to when species started to split their DNA and then combine it with somebody else. So again, there's two ways to make babies. One is to clone one's genes, and the other one is to combine one with somebody else. Now, nature has both processes because, of course, it's easier if you can just make your own cells. It doesn't depend upon a mate. However, by creating genetic diversity through the blending of genes, this is what they say creates more viable offspring. Again, the combination of different genetics from the environment enables a species to be stronger, healthier, withstand more stuff, less susceptible to viruses, things along this line. So, if you guys get into ancient biology and why this evolved over time, that is kind of the core of it. At some point in our evolution, we as a species evolved in the ability to split our genes from male and female, mom and dad, and then combine those back together to create something uniquely different than either of the parents. A blend of both parents, but not exact copies of both parents. So when we go to blend our DNA, when you have the sperm and the egg, okay, those contain what we need. Those combine, you get 23 pairs of chromosomes, half of it from your parent, your mom, and then 23 pairs from your parents to get 46 chromosomes in total. I'm so sorry, 23 pairs in total, but 46 total, but then those combine to become 23. I have a picture here in a second that shows you. Okay. All right. So the DNA contain the instructions on how to make a body. Okay. And so that's the core idea. We as a species combine our DNA to make babies. Cool. So you get 23 from your mom, 23 from your dad, and those mix and then create chromosomes. Okay. My biology skills are not as adept. And the more I teach psychology, the more I have to delve into biology. Just to give this lecture, I had to go watch a ton of videos on epigenetics and how DNA works and the basic processes of biology. But I guess that's the beauty of learning. Okay. So the male has a gamete and the female has a gamete. These are our reproductive cells. Okay. The sperm and the egg. When those two combine, those 23 pairs from each, 46 in total become 23 chromosomes. They just combine, you get a little bit from each one. All right. All right. So that's the idea of that. At the beginning of life, within hours of conception, the zygote begins the duplication and division process. And then as cells divide and they get the encoding from the DNA and the RNA interprets that DNA, it then tells that cell what to become. So as the cells split and split more, they get more and more specific as to what they're going to split into. Okay, but again, it's the RNA that interprets the DNA, and then it decides how much proteins are supposed to be released to enable, tell a gene whether to activate or whether to not activate a gene. And again, the more I got into it, the more super complex all of this got. And so, again, if you want a little bit of research on this, check it out. See how we get the pairs from our mom and the pairs that are dad, and they come together to form our 23 chromosomes, okay? And then I'll show you the inside of the chromosome, and it has two little parts, one from the mom, one from the dad. All right, cool. All right, so when it comes to biological sex and gender, we have narrowed it down to the 23rd chromosome. So it's on the 23rd chromosome that dictates whether a body will turn into a male or a female. And we are specifically talking about biological sex here, the formation of gonads, hormones, chromosomal, number 23 chromosomes, reproductive parts. All of this occurs, based upon the instructions that are contained in the 23rd chromosome, which we have a picture of it coming up here. Okay. Gender is something we'll get into a little bit later. We'll ask questions about how does our bodies influence our gender identity, but gender is, what's supposed to be a socially constructed cultural structure that dictates, how we're supposed to conform our behavior to meet these expectations of society. We will get into that later, but for this one, we're just talking specifically about biological sex. All right. So here is the pictures, okay? Now we get 20, so each one of these are a chromosome, but then each chromosome has, information from your mom and then from your dad. And it's here on the 23rd chromosome that dictates whether it's going to be a male or a female. Okay, so here is a female, you have two XXs, and then here is a male, you have an XY. Okay, and so that's what decides the difference. It's on this 23rd chromosome. So the 23rd chromosome pair that consists of an X-shaped chromosome from the mother and a Y-shaped chromosome from the father. Okay, that's how you dictate which sex it's going to be. All right. So this is interesting. I had to stare at this chart for a while and really just, so if you need to pause the video and think about it, but just look at the difference here and here. And then when we start to get into things like gene disorders, it's going to be the same things. We're going to find that, on these specific chromosomes, that's where these disorders tend to arise. Now, as you guys get deeper into this science and you start to study it, these chromosomes also contain information for how tall someone's going to be, or how short someone's going to be. It has a range of, how, the fat content of your body, more tendency toward obesity, less tendency toward obesity. It has determinations of whether or not you could be influenced by alcoholism and autism, things along those lines. And again, so when you guys study the gene disorders, which I have on a last slide, those are highly influenced by your genetics. So where and which specific gene. But again, this is stuff that we're just now learning about. We've only recently discovered that, a sex is determined based upon the 23rd chromosome. And then when we start to get into intersex, that's when we start to find things like, does somebody have an extra chromosome or are they lacking a chromosome? And then that can influence, genitalia, hormones, things along those lines. And so when you go to ask how many sexes are there, there's male, female, and then there's intersex, variations of the XX or the XY on that 23rd chromosome. And 1 out of 100 people are susceptible to this. And I think the ratio is something like it's a lower percentage, under 1%, that specifically is like hermaphroditic, but still the variations in that 23rd chromosome create what is a third sex, So if you, the question is, how many sexes are there? At least three, because we've actually found over 100 combinations of intersex along with variations of the 23rd chromosome. Okay. So because the Y chromosome is passed down to every male descendant, and because the Y changes very little from generation to the next, men today have the Y of their male ancestors who died thousands of years ago. Female ancestors also live on. Each zygote has mitochondria, biological material that provides energy for the cell. The mitochondria come from the mother and her mother and her mother, and thus each person carries evidence of their maternal lineage. And so again, how does your ancestral DNA influence you over time? Okay. That's the question that you'll be asking when it comes to developmental psychology. How does your DNA, your ancestral DNA, influence your personality? How does it influence your susceptibility to disease? How does it influence your height? And these are all questions that we should asking. Okay? But again, a lot of these don't have super specific answers. So like when they say that genetics accounts for height, geneticists have only accounted for about 10% of the specific DNA code, the ATGC, or the combinations of AA, AT, G with C, G with T, that specifically align with height. Same thing for obesity. They found that people are more likely to be obese if on the specific chromosome they have two, or a specific DNA strand, they have two A's instead of like an A and a T. So people who have two A's in the specific code out of the 3 million, instructions, they're the ones who could biologically be more likely to be obese. And again, I'll put up a couple more videos just to fill you guys in on this, especially with my lacking in the biology and trying to explain, cell division and how people turn out the way they are, because it's very, very complex and I'm always having to learn myself. But the idea again is we combine our DNA with our mom and our dad. We get 23 pairs from each parent, and then those combine and make our 23 chromosomes, okay? And so all those chromosomes make up our DNA, but then it's an RNA that interprets or transcribes the DNA instructions, and then that interacts with the environment to decide how many proteins or not proteins are going to be released, and that dictates whether your genes are expressed in specific ways. It's a whole big rant that I'm having to memorize in my head, but again, it's super complex, okay? But again, even with all of this genetic variation, humans are pretty much the same. Okay, there's no such thing as like all black people share common genes and all white people share common genes. That's totally a bunch of crap. And even the idea that men and women are like somehow super different from each other is completely arguable. Yes, in the brain, there's like maybe some gray matter differences and maybe some visual versus spatial and emotional intelligence differences, but who can really tell whether that comes from learned experiences or whether that's really based in our bodies. And yes, there are hormonal levels that could influence our behavior, but it's very argumentative as to whether our biological sex truly does influence like our, gender identity, So these are some debates that we'll get into a little bit later in this class. I mean, we haven't even opened up with like when do kids learn what gender they belong to and their how to, and once they belong to that group, how does that influence their behavior? But genetically, we're all basically the same. So again, if you like look at someone who's of a different race from you, you've been thinking the whole time that person's different, you're wrong. That person is just not different. Like it's very complicated. When we did the Human Genome Project, someone from China had more in common with someone in Scotland than the next door neighbor in Scotland had to them. And again, how does that work? Someone in China has more similar DNA to someone in Scotland than some other dude in Scotland. But again, that's because it's very complicated and a lot of it's counterintuitive. There's more genetic differences within groups than there are between groups. So that, I'm not going to go off on that whole rant today, but when I'm teaching race and ethnicity, that's a rant that I would go off on. But again, for this class, we're just asking the questions of how do these genes influence over time? And the main point is we're just now discovering how they influence over time. For example, when it takes take mice, mom mice that are really good at cleaning their babies later on in life show less stress hormones, meaning they're just more chill, a little bit more comfortable, whatever it might be. Moms who are not great at like cleaning their babies and taking care of their babies later on in life show higher levels of stress hormones, which suggests things like how does your parenting influence your actual body. So if you had great parents that were constantly hugging you and loving on you, do you have less stress hormone and, expression later on in life? But again, a lot of that is due to gene expressions. How does gene expression influence how much stress hormones we have later in life? And this is the kind of science that we're just now figuring out. So again, it's cool to be getting in on some of this psychology now because it's a pretty new science and people are just now figuring out, how do our genes, how does our DNA, how does the way our body functions and our brain functions truly influence our behavior? Okay? Not just on a psychological level, but on a biological level. Because, for example, kids that grow up in, rough situations, how does that influence them across the lifespan? Not just psychologically. Because again, we want to say like, oh, they had a bad childhood, they're psychologically traumatized. But is it more complicated than that? Does that psychological trauma as a kid actually affect your gene expression and then the way your body functions across your life? And does that also affect how you pass it on to your kids? So again, the more I study it, the more questions I have, the cooler I think this subject is. But again, the idea of how does our body and our DNA influence the way we think and behave is a brand new science that we're just now starting to, tap into. And that's what introduces you to this idea of epigenetics. Okay, epigenetics is the way that the environment influences with your genes. It influences the way that your RNA interprets your DNA and decides which light switches to turn on or off. And again, all new science, but epigenetics is the way that the environment affects your genetics, how the environment alters genetic expression. And this begins at conception and continues lifelong. Why are our bodies susceptible to the environment? Why is gene expression susceptible to the environment? This is built into our bodies so that our bodies can evolve based upon changes in the environment itself. What happens if you live on top of mountains? How does that influence your gene expression? Is it important if you live on top of mountains to pass the ability of your kids to get more oxygen than people that live at lower levels so that they can better withstand the effects of the environment in a mountainous area? And this is the idea, right? So if you grow up in the mountains versus along the beach and you're hold for generations and thousands of years it was that way, then you would start to see some genetic differences between the mountain people and the beach dwellers. But in modern times, because of globalism, there's very few isolated groups out there. So yes, maybe some Sherpas have like, the ability to take in more oxygen than someone from England, but at the same time, those people have been blending with people from England now for a while. And so, how is that affecting their genetics? Are they still distinctly different in their ability to take in oxygen over time if they keep blending with Europeans, for example, or some people from different countries? And so, that's kind of the idea of even though there used to be these isolated groups, in modern times, they don't really exist anymore, which is kind of why most humans are pretty much the same. But epigenetics is a really cool science. I'm going to put up a video for this that delves into how does the environment influence your gene expression. And now they're just asking the question, can the environment actually affect your DNA itself? And then can you then pass that down to your kids? And for a long time, it was thought that the environment could not affect the DNA itself, just gene expression. But now we're maybe finding some information that's contrary to that. And again, this is why identical twins tend to be different even though they share the exact same genes. Why are they different? Because they share maybe different environments. Yes, they might live in like a shared environment, but even in that shared environment, they have divergent experiences. They're exposed to different things. They might eat different types of food, drink different types of beverages, socialize in different ways. And it's actually these things that influence their gene expression and influence their behavior. Okay. So even if someone's born with an identical copy of, whatever someone else has, that doesn't mean they're going to be identical because of the epigenetic effects, the influence of the environment upon the genes. And the same thing goes with mice. They've done lots of studies on mice. Some we could question the ethicalness about it, but the same thing goes here. When you super inbreed mice, which they have done to make them really the same, they still end up a little bit different. And that's kind of the idea. All right. So, You have monozygotic twins, twins who come from the same zygote that splits apart, and then they have identical twins, and then you have dizotic twins that, share the same genetics, just like a brother and a sister, but they're just born at the same time. And so monozygotic twins shared common DNA, and then dizygotic twins share DNA in the way that any other sibling would with somebody else because they were created by two separate ovum. Now, yes, monozygotic twins, identical twins tend to be more similar than dizygotic twins, but again, monozygotic twins don't end up completely identical because they don't share exactly the same experiences. Sometimes it differs, okay? So stem cells and differentiation, when we are first created, we are all just a bunch of stem cells. And then as the DNA gets interpreted by the RNA, these cells then begin to differentiate into the cells that become our heart, our liver, other parts of our body. Okay, and so that's how that process works. Let's walk through some vocabulary words just so you guys have it. Genotype refers to all the genes a person has once the mom and the dad DNA comes together, and then you get your 23 chromosomes, pairs of chromosomes, okay? Yeah, I always say that wrong. So you get 46, 23 from each, and you get 23 pairs of chromosomes, which are then like in a, chromosome. I think that's right. Okay, even though I feel like that's wrong. Genotype, all the genes of a person. Phenotype, these are specifically just the observable characters. What can you see with your eyes, your ears, okay? Appearance, personality, intelligence, all those types of traits. Your phenotype is influenced by your genetics and then your environmental experiences. And then the way you interact with the environment affects your genes and your alleles. And alleles are just, what makes you different from somebody else. Okay? Again, we don't need to get super deep into the whole processes of genetics, but again, you have dominant, genes, and then you have recessive genes, and your book gets pretty deep into how that influences it. I know you guys have probably done the charts on this, so I'm not going to go super deep into how, you do a little box of four and you put dominant and recessive, and then you check out which is which. And, it's usually 3 out of 4 boxes are dominant and 1 out of 4 boxes is recessive. And so that's kind of the statistics. You got like a 25% chance of getting the recessive genes, 75% chance of getting the dominant genes. All right. And then to wrap this up, which, I put an assignment on this, we have our chromosomal and genetic problems. So as I was saying from that picture before, if the 23rd chromosome doesn't have an XX or an XY, you can maybe have something with an XX and a Y. Then you have something like Klinefelter's syndrome. When you have an X and two Ys, you get into Jacob's syndrome. When you have three X's, you get into triple X syndrome. And then an X, oh, only one sex chromosome, Turner syndrome, would just be an X. Okay, so these are some things you can look at. And then here's the physical appearances of each. Some versions of intersex are reproducible. Some versions of intersex are not. Some impair you and some maybe don't. But as you guys can see over here, with Klinefelters, you can have some learning disabilities, but this one's usually quite survivable. Jacobs syndrome, you have the risk of intellectual impairment. And then, triple X syndrome, impaired in most skills. And then X, some learning disabilities. Okay? Your book also gets into things like Down syndrome and what causes that. But again, I put all this into an assignment so you guys can pretty much work through that. I don't want to go through all of it because it'll just be too much information. What we need to take from this is that our genes, our DNA influence our behavior and the formation of our body. And we can have problems that are located in specific genes, and then these genes also have the ability to instruct us in how tall or short we are, the size of our hands, whatever it might be. Okay, so 99% of newborns have the usual 46 chromosomes. Severe dominant disorders are rare because people who usually have them die before puberty and they never pass on that gene to another generation. However, if a dominant disorder does not appear until adulthood or it could stay in the gene pool, These adults might have several children before they know there's an issue. So that's kind of where the idea of genetic testing comes in. Okay, I hope was just a pretty good introduction to how genes in our bodies influence our development. I don't expect you to be experts on DNAs and know specifically which chromosome all the gene disorders occur, but we need to be aware that gene disorders can occur and that can affect kids and adults. And then if we, so as you guys do this assignment, just look into some research, pick a couple that are interesting to you and delve deep into those. Okay, thank you so much.